Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung, Earthlets, and welcome to the 2000 AD Thrillcast, the fourth of our lockdown tapes as we undergo self-isolation in the sub-basement of the 2000 AD Nerve Centre. I really hope that you're staying safe and well. Thank you so much for all the fantastic feedback we've been getting about the lockdown tapes. It's really appreciated that, some people have said these are just helping pass the time a little bit, reduce the stress as we delve into the galaxy's greatest comic. On this episode, we have two main guests and a colleague. We have Rob Williams and Simon Fraser. Now, if you've not read 2000 AD Prog 2175 and you don't know what's inside, then you might want to skip this part of the episode, Earthlets, because major spoilers ahead. You have been warned. Well, don't say we didn't warn you, Earthlets. Judge Barbara Hershey is back in Disease, which is a brand new series from Rob Williams and Si Fraser, which began this week. Lots of division in opinion online, both for and against. So, must be a 2000 AD series. But we've got Rob and Si on to talk about what the intentions of the new series are, what the genesis of it was, how it fits together with the events of Guatemala last year. This was the first major challenge for the new setup of the Thrillcast, so we had quite a few gremlins, so unfortunately we had to interview them separately. But nonetheless, we got through, we had a chat, and it was great. After we talked to them, I've got my colleague Owen Johnson chatting about Case Files 35. We do a bit of a deep dive. It's the first time he's ever read those Dredd stories. It's the second time for me. So we delve into some of the context. We look at how the collection holds together. It is available to pre-order now from shop.2000ad.com. So head along to there. Why Case Files 35? Well, because it's got the awesome Sin City, which is a prime slice of John Wagner and Kev Walker work in there, as well as some other great stories. So don't think just because we're getting into the later volumes of the series that there's nothing of interest. You'd be missing out on some absolutely fantastic Judge Dredd. So, without much further ado, we are going to crack on with chatting to Rob about Hershey Disease. New series has started. We kept it under wraps so that it was a surprise for everybody. Now we went into quite a bit of detail in the press release that we put out. But do you want to explain to people who haven't seen that the origin of Hershey Disease?
Well, it came about at the end of the Small House, really, which was there was this. I felt like I've been building for a number of years that. This tension between Dredd and Hershey. So when it finally burst, and there was the kind of the moment where Dredd said, "I no longer recognise your authority," and did it publicly in front of other judges in the Great Grand Hall of Justice. That was kind of the end. She was the busted flush from that point. She had no authority. He knew what he was doing, and it was time for her to go. And I think the origin of that went back a while before that, and an email exchange between myself and Matt Smith, where I think when I was planning the Small House, I went, look, it feels like it's time to get rid of Hershey, because every time I wrote a Dredd, all she was in a planning room in the Grand Hall of Justice looking out over the city, and it was a bit like, it felt like her as Chief Judge had run its course. So Matt obviously had to run that past John Wagner. I think, if I remember right, John still had some thought of plans for Hershey. So he said, no, we can't get rid of her. But Matt said, you can effectively make it the straw that breaks the camel's back, which is where I no longer, recognize your authority came from. But when we actually did it, and as great a moment as it was, I actually felt a bit guilty, because I felt like we'd undersold her as a character a bit, because that entire story was entirely understandably Dredd's point of view. And I thought Hershey's this got this amazing history in the Dredd strip, and I just kind of felt like she became a little bit of a punching bag, and she deserved to have her moment. So it was just like an idea where I just said to Matt, look, would it be up for me writing a Hershey series? And he said, yeah, that's fine. But I've got to run it past John. He did, and John came back and apparently and said, yeah, that was fine. So it was building for a while. It was an organic kind of thing. It was never sort of a big plan. I never had any aspirations to write a Hershey series. It was more just trying to do right by the character, really, off the back of the Small House. And I felt like she needed a moment to tell her own emotional story, her version of those events.
One of the things that has been commented upon with the whole, the death, the very moving death scene that John wrote, and the fact that we kept this under wraps. So people thought she was dead, and now she's back. There's been a lot of discussion about the meaning of death for comic book characters, and whether, for example, American superhero comics have devalued that. And tying that into 2000 AD's reputation, even if it's not entirely true that once our characters die, they stay dead. Johnny Alpha. But what's your take on that? Because I've seen negative and positive reactions to the whole thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, in general, the general point you're making, I mean, yeah, one of the things that I think Dredd in 2000 AD has done since I was a kid, which blew you away, is like amazing characters just died, and didn't come back. And there's so many things like when Giant first died. I remember, the older Giant, when Orlok killed him. I remember being as a kid like, you can't do that. That's one of the main characters, and it's all. Dredd and Dredd's world, they've always been sort of quite willing to kill off amazing characters. Like the Angel Gang going, you could bring those back over. Well, I guess Mean did come back over and over again. So I do think that is something the 2000 has always done. I mean, with this, all I can say is, this was planned and part written, pretty much half written before John just was killing Hershey off in Guatemala. So there is an organic kind of genesis to this. I get it if people. I mean, the thing is, John wrote that death scene, and it was hugely touching. People love this character, and I get that a lot of people would read that and think, well, that was the end, and I had my emotional moment there, And for her to find out that she's still alive, I can understand why some people would be upset by that. I would say that thematically, I think this series completely stays true to what she was going through in that moment. And I said in the press release, I mean, one of the inspirations for this series is John Borman's Point Blank, and there's a school of reading Point Blank whereby everything that happens in Point Blank is Lee Marvin's character's death fantasy because he's shot in the opening scene, and none of it actually happens. It's just a revenge fantasy as he's dying. And so if it bothers you, I guess you can see this Hershey series in much the same light, to be honest with you. But because in a way, she's part of the point of this series is she feels like her life is over. Her life is over, and it's like, well, what do you do now? And she doesn't know. So I like to think we're being true to the spirit of it, at least.
Is there an intention that this is still proceeding towards an end?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give too much away
because she is still dying. I mean, you make it quite clear in the first episode or two that the microbe that quote unquote killed her is still there and is causing her an insurmountable amount of pain, or near insurmountable amount of pain. So it's not as if she's 20 years old again and bounding around the galaxy solving crimes. This is the tail end of her life.
And she refuses. She feels guilty at what she let happen. She felt like she got lazy and she lazy might not put it this way. She just got so caught up in the minutiae of running Mega City One, but she missed a lot of the important things that she should have. She let her edge slip is the best way of putting it. And she, certain things happened. It ties back into the Judge Smiley stuff. She let Smiley operate with impunity. Dredd was right about that when he called her out. She knows Dredd was right. She feels guilty. She doesn't feel that she deserves a cure. These pills that she's got with her in this series, they're not going to cure it, but they will ease her pain. And she flatly refuses to take those pills because she has a feeling that she needs to earn it again. But at its heart, I think she's flailing and she is scared and angry, and she wants to take it out on a few people who deserve it. She wants to do right. She feels like she let certain things slip, and this is her opportunity to put a few things right, and then she can go.
The plot that this feeds into follows on from Trifecta, which she did with Al Ewing and Si Spurrier. I mean, that was a good few years ago now. And this followed through on The Small House. And it's all to do with Judge Smiley, this Machiavellian figure which has been manipulating Justice Department and world events for longer than anyone really realised. Is this you tying up the ends of that plot? Now that, spoilers for anybody who hasn't read The Small House, now that Smiley is dead, is this the denouement? Is this the tidying up?
Yeah, I mean, you see in episode 1 of this, there's a map and there's certain international. I mean, part of the high concept was a long walk, an international long walk, and like John Wagner wrote a line into one of the final scenes between Dredd and Hershey, which she was planning to go on an international tour, rather than the traditional long walk out into the cursed earth. So she is going to travel around the globe, and she's going to follow these, effectively the Smiley thing and what she allowed to happen on her watch eats at her. So now she is going to follow certain places where Smiley, in the same way that like the CIA have operated over the last 50 years of sort of Western history, she's going to go to those places where Smiley sold his Enceladus energy, for certain things that came back the other way, and where he altered the political, the political setup of certain sort of cities, and she's going to go in there and she's going to stamp it all out. She's going to put this right because it happened on her watch.
And one of the things that is really striking about this series is Si's artwork. Now, it's interesting that you have mentioned Point Blank again, the '67 film, because that's film noir, and there's Simon's use of single color for each of the pages, or near to single color. It gives it an incredible, even though it's quite bright colors, still got an incredibly noir feel to the whole thing.
Yeah, it's and again in the planning we talked about it. We said it's. We talked a lot about Point Blank. We talked a lot about he's talked about it's a subjective coloring. It's very much about the mood of how she's feeling. So it wouldn't be remotely right for it to be a black and white sort of a sort of multicolored world. It's a very sort of, the mood of the coloring on the page that he's used is to put you inside her head and her emotions. There's other interesting things we talked about doing. We didn't want it to feel like a normal 2000 AD strip. So even things like the page design of issue, page 1 of every issue has got the Hershey logo going up the side of the page. That's not traditional. There's certain things we wanted to do with. There's a lot of trying for not much dialogue in a lot of places. Let the mood sort of permeate. There's a real tendency I find when I write 2000 AD. I think we all do really, because you've only got 6-page chunks. You cram a lot in, you can find it. You've got to be careful. You don't necessarily give it. It's really difficult to give 2000 AD stories room to breathe, an atmosphere to build in silent panels and things like that, which you can sometimes do elsewhere. So there's a real effort made on things like that as well. all of these things we talked about, and yeah, Si's done a beautiful job. You only have to look at issue 1 and see it. I think one of the things that's nice about it is he's succeeded in it doesn't feel like your traditional 2000 AD approach at this world. We're coming at it a slightly different way, and it's kind of gorgeous stuff.
Looking back on the history of Hershey as a character, do you ever get the sense that she's, I don't know, been poorly served by in the past? Because stretching all the way back to the Judge Child, she had an important part to play in that, and then as she entered the period when she was Chief Judge, there's always that, and you touched on it in the Small House, there's always that sense that she is or was serving at the discretion of Dredd. That he is the linchpin that shores up her role, her rule as Chief Judge. Do you think that has underserved the character? Because I went back through case files number 35 with Owen Johnson from Rebellion, and one of the things that really struck me about one of the early moments in that is that there is almost Wagner parodying that conflict between Dredd and Hershey, and that they go through an argument where he challenges her and she thumps the table. Then they go next door to have the proper meeting where they're going to talk about the undercover operation that's going on in Sin City. So this has been a dynamic for so long that actually, Wagner was kind of mocking it all the way back in 2002. So do you think that kind of shows that perhaps she'd fall into a bit of a rut?
Yeah, I think she'd fallen into a rut. And even if you I've got my, shall I grab, if I can find it, my, bear with me, call that. I've got the old Titan Judge Child, sort of, are we allowed to show those, or is that against Rebellion policy? But no, if you even when she turns up, it's kind of weird that she's stuck with readers to the point she did, because she is kind of like just one of the team on Justice 1. She's introduced there, and then she is kind of like she's a foil. I don't think she particularly shows any kind of. She's not like in the same way like Anderson is quite irreverent with Dredd or something. Hershey's just is a good strong judge. I thought Al Ewing did. I forget which storyline it was in, but it was like I remember one was when Hershey was Chief Judge, and her and Dredd had this argument, and she said something to Dredd about like, if you haven't got the guts to take the top job, you know what I mean, then just all you do is come in here and grouch at me, but you haven't got the. I forget the exact line, but it was something along the lines of, you haven't got the guts to actually take this seat. I thought that was a really good line. Al did some good stuff with her, and then, but like I said, I mean, I guess it's true of all of them, apart from if you're going to be Magruder and you're going to sort of grow massive hairy chin or something. Once you're the Chief Judge, you effectively, by the nature of the role, you become an administrator. So it's kind of hard to serve them well, emotionally or just in a distinctive way. But one of the things, again, going back to issue one of this, is there's a scene where Dredd and Hershey are on the bikes, and that dialogue is taken from a scene that John Wagner wrote following the Small House. But I kind of wanted, the internal monologue is new, so the dialogue is all John's, but the internal monologue is Hershey's monologue, her way of looking at that scene, and the subtextual kind of way that she might say, "Oh, thank you, Dredd, I appreciate it," but inwardly, this tension still, it's got to, still exists between them. So it's just, I guess what this series is just trying to give her that inner life of her own.
And it's interesting in the first few episodes of this, because obviously in the office we're a few episodes ahead of everybody else, is just how, and you mentioned this in the press release, you're kind of trying to give Hershey's side of this, because her history is dominated by Dredd. Aside from the stories in the 1990s, which I was a fan of at the time. I don't know about anybody else, but she's always played second fiddle. She's always being seen in the context of Dredd, even in Judgment Day.
Yeah.
You know, she's on the front line, firing away, fighting the zombies, but it's still always in view, in context of what Dredd is doing. So it's interesting that you've said you're keen to have her side of the story.
It's Dredd's world, right? It's Dredd's strip, and it's even, I think you even when, I'm writing a Dredd at the moment with various other characters in it. You can never take the camera too far away, but then it becomes quite difficult to give any of the other characters Dredd's backing cast, to give them a satisfying kind of it's always, you're always sort of, the journey is according to his decisions, you know what I mean, which takes agency away from the other characters. So unless you give them their own strip, like with Anderson, or I don't know, even with something like with Low Life and Dirty Frank or something. But it's kind of it's always going to be Dredd's story, which is fine. But there's I think sometimes it's kind of fun, and we've got the ability with 2000 AD, especially with the magazine as well. How many Dredd World things are there? You can actually go away and you can. It's nice to give these people their moment, even if it is potentially the last moment they ever have, maybe.
And in terms of your reaction to the strip, I know you've written it, but there's always a certain element of how you're feeling at the time, what you're thinking at the time that gets put into a strip. Is there an element of you in here?
Yeah, I mean, I was feeling a bit uneasy about talking about these type of things publicly, but I think I was feeling quite burnt out at the time, and she is, and so that's why it kind of that's kind of where it works. Put it this, I totally get where she was coming from. I think the core thing for her at this point is my entire life has been working up to this moment, this pinnacle, which is for her Chief Judge. She can't go any higher than being Chief Judge, and then she's done that for a while. It's impossible to sustain that for any length of time. It ends, and what do you do then? You know what I mean? And is there anything? There's like on page 2, I think, of this first episode. It's like a doctor says to her, "How do you feel?" And she doesn't answer immediately. The doctor repeats the question. She says, "I don't know." And I think that was what was interesting to me, to write a story about a character who is looking for purpose and meaning and not necessarily sure they can find it. You know what I mean? It's like, so without going into too many things with me, but I think when I was writing it, I was feeling a lot of the same things. I kind of got it, which is possibly, I hope, if it's got any kind of resonance, that's probably a good thing. But it's, there's so many things in it as well. She looks, one thing Si and I agreed on from the start was, like, I think Si said, he goes, I want to draw, if I'm going to do this, I want to draw her age. I don't want to draw some hot young Hershey running around in a tight jumpsuit. And I was like, absolutely. Thematically, that makes perfect sense. She is near dead, burnt out at the end of her life, and so it's quite refreshing. How many strips, how many contemporary comic strips draw an action strip with an aging, female lead, basically. You know what I mean? She's so that was something that excited both of us. But the 14-year-old fanboys might not be too pleased by it.
I kind of really asked you about the direction of this, and without wanting to give too much away, are you pleased with how the story has turned out?
Yeah, I've got to be honest. I wrote it some time ago, and you forget. I do. I'm a very forgetful person, and I forget a lot of what's in it. So when it turns up sometimes in the prog, you do kind of go, "Oh, that's a nice surprise. I'd forgotten that." Yeah, I am. I think it feels like it's a personal small scale story. I mean, without giving too much away, the thing I'm writing, for instance, at the moment in Dredd is a very large scale story, and it's kind of refreshing to just bunker down into a character, make it about one character, get in their head emotionally, and yeah, I mean, and I think tonally and aesthetically, it looks beautiful, and it's really refreshing to do things which are a bit outside the norm occasionally, you know.
Well, that was awesome, and thanks very much to Rob. Now we're going to talk to Simon Fraser. Like I said, we've had some gremlins with the transatlantic signal, so there is a little bit of glitching all the way through, but I hope it doesn't disturb your enjoyment of a nice little chat with Simon Fraser. I want to talk to you about the very distinctive style, because you know, each page you're using a particular color. It's structured differently. Do you want to take us through your process and your decision making on how you wanted this to look?
Well, Rob came up with his very specific styling cues, which is he liked the Thomas Crown Affair and Point Blank, which are films with very specific visual styles. And I know that I tend to do, or Gary and I tend to do, very colorful comics. And so I thought that the obvious way to kind of like go somewhere else is to change the coloring style. Color is a storytelling device entirely. It's not decorative. So it's kind of in keeping with the spareness of the story, because it's a very kind of pared down, there's very little dialogue. It's all about kind of internal life for her, for Hershey, and giving her kind of a voice, but she's not saying very much, but it's all about her emotional state. So I wanted to pare it down. At the same time, the artwork gets quite noodly and dense periodically, because I'm trying to build a sort of like an intense environment world for her to exist in. And because I now have a lot more page space, because there's no dialogue anymore. I mean, there's very little dialogue. There's no explanations. There's no caption boxes. There's people saying having terse conversations. But I have a lot more space to play with on the page, which is wonderful. So I want to use that. So I'm getting quite intricate pages, quite a lot of environments, and the color is specifically to tell the story, and to describe like atmosphere and the emotional tone. So I'll go through a sequence, for example, with very muted somber colors, and then it goes bright red when there's something incredibly dangerous happening, so violence or something like that. And that's a very simple example. But I've got sort of very cool blue when she's in a kind of like almost like a funk. She's not in a good state of mind, and it goes very to the sort of subdued spectrum. So it's all sort of calculated out, and also just so I can do the whole thing myself, because I can't really do a full color comic all by my own. I mean, it'll take twice as long. And it's nice to be able to have control of everything, every aspect of the storytelling, and do that right. I haven't really done that for, God, when did I last do that? Shimura, I think, back when I was starting out. So it's fun. It's great fun for me. That's the short, long answer. It's a very long answer.
Long answers are good. So with the styles of this, it's recognizably your style, but I'm detecting elements of other artists. I see perhaps kind of Ulysses Farinas.
Yeah, I know Ulysses. He's a friend of mine. Yeah, we used to work together with the Webcomics Collective. He's very, very good at that kind of environmental noodly, sort of Jeff Darroway kind of like building complex environments using lots of telling detail. So no, that's good. I mean, it's not deliberate, but I like his stuff a lot. He's a smart guy.
Well, one of the things that we chatted with Rob about was about the noir aspects, particularly the kind of mono coloring. Just make it feel a lot more noir than it would if it was full color. I presume that kind of feeds back into what you were talking about that kind of emotional intensity, about the coloring and the shadows and everything, kind of illustrating how she's feeling.
I'm using a lot of like light sourcing. The thing is, it's set in Colombia technically, so I don't know if I'm being strictly accurate with the ambient lighting, but I can use dramatic light sourcing, which is what noir is all about, very simple, strong lighting, to create an emotion for a scene. So noir isn't realistic, it's emotionally realistic rather than visually realistic. But we're so used to this visual language already that we just take it as being real. It really isn't. And noir kind of constructed this visual lexicon, and I'm definitely using that because I'm a film student. That's where I come from. So this is fun for me.
One thing that's been commented on an awful lot is the fact that you've drawn Hershey as an older woman. For many people, that means that you're drawing her as she should be, which is a woman in her 60s. Rob has said that was a conscious choice on your part. Do you want to explain a little bit more about the rationale on that?
I just think it's a much more interesting choice. I mean, what tends to happen is that the female characters in comics in general, but I think what's interesting is Judge Dredd has allowed Dredd to age, but none of his supporting cast get to age. He gets older, but he's rejuving himself, whatever it is. But I assume that rejuving is not a perfect cosmetic thing. It keeps him healthy and it keeps him fit, but it doesn't make him look nice. I don't think even in the future, and this is my kind of like my wish, is that we don't have these perfect cosmetic procedures that make everybody look wonderful and young all the time. You may be able to be fit, and Hershey is very, very strong. She's top of her game in terms of her abilities. And that's what she does, maybe uses the rejuving for, but not to make herself look nice. That's not who she is. She's got a lot of strong sense of herself. She's a very strong woman. She's been in a position of authority for a long time. And she doesn't need to take any crap from anybody. And she certainly doesn't need to look nice, look pretty, not young pretty. I think she looks great. I mean, I think she's a strong woman. She's going to look terrible by the end of this story because she's going to go through some hell. But I think it's emotionally important to have her be who she is, her age inside, and actually look like that. I mean, I think it's a certain extent dishonest to have her looking 25 or 30 all the time. I don't like that. I prefer that she's a real 50, 60 something woman doing things that are hard and they have an effect on her and her body. And it feels hard, and it should feel hard. You know what it's like. You're 40 something. It feels hard.
Thanks a lot. Yes, getting out of bed this morning was very hard. That's not entirely to do with self-isolation either.
Yeah. Definitely not getting any exercise.
So, what was your reaction when Rob talked to you about the idea? Or was this more a kind of collaborative thing that you both came up with the idea?
It was Rob's idea. I mean, Rob and I are always sort of talking to each other about things. We agree on a lot of things. A lot of cultural landmarks are the same. We've been friends for years. So he knows where I'm at. He knows what I'm thinking. It's strange because I got to Hershey via two other middle-aged, black-haired women with bobs, because I was supposed to be doing something which I talked to you about. Remember, a comic convention in New York a couple of years ago about doing maybe a Durham Red story. And I thought, well, that'd be fun to draw because I like drawing Durham Red. She's a great design character. And then, of course, that didn't work out. And then Matt said to me, how about we get Lulu Romanoff? And I went, ooh, that's interesting. But I couldn't do that with anyone but Robbie. So I said to Robbie, how do you feel about that? But he's not 100% there with that yet. We discussed it for a bit. It didn't really work out. And then Rob came up with Hershey, and I'm going, there's clearly something happening here. This is definitely going to happen, but not with the first choice or the second choice. But a woman in her middle age with black bob is going to be in my life.
And one thing I did want to ask about was the design of the pages, because obviously you've got the Hershey logo going down the left-hand side of the front page, and that feels quite cinematic, coming back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah. I mean, that's Rob specifically, he wanted that, but it's harkening back to the early Dredd logos, which were kind of this rocky, chunky thing going down the left-hand side of the page, very structural. You'll see as it goes on, you can compare those left-hand logos as it goes through. They're going to change, and that's part of the narrative as well. So yeah, that's definitely, that was from Rob, but we're definitely working with that as a storytelling element to it too.
It's been a while since you've been in the prog on a regular basis. How do you feel you have changed as an artist over the last? I mean, when was the last episode of Nikolai Dante?
I think it's like 12 years ago. It's a long time ago. It's a long time. I mean, the last episode in Dante was the 40th anniversary one. That was a couple of years ago. But before that, it was ages. I haven't done much for 2000 AD for quite a long time. I mean, I'd have to look at the calendar to work it out, but it's been an awful lot longer than I thought it was going to be, frankly. Because I went off and did Doctor Who for 3 years, I did Kingsman, and I've done a bunch of other things. And the years just poof, and suddenly you're like, wait, it's been an awful long time since it's been 2000 AD. That feels wrong. So it was nice to be back.
And in terms of your style, how has that time away changed you, do you think? Has it changed you?
I mean, I now know how to do a 22-page-a-month comic. I didn't know how to do that 10 years ago. But the same, I mean, what I'm doing now is Hershey is now my first fully digital piece of work. There's no original artwork for this. It's not, I mean, I do some pencil layouts just to sort of do my thinking, but the actual artwork is all done digitally. So that's a big step for me. That was a big thing, which I've been working towards for a long time, but for some various reasons and technical reasons and time reasons, I never got around to. But now I'm doing it and I'm having a whale of a time. It's great. I wish I'd done it 5 years ago when everybody told me to. So I'm like, that's the biggest technical thing. I think in terms of the style, it's very much an evolution of what I've been doing. The page layout, though, that's definitely new, because for Dante, I decided deliberately early on to do a very conventional straight panel layout. And over time, that just became my default because I'd done so much of it with Dante that I thought that's just the way I draw. And I went back in my head and thought, wait, I used to do lots of elaborate layouts, so I think we'll do that again. So going back to doing layouts, and that's very easy to do in Clip Studio because you can really play with layouts in Clip Studio, and it's fun. So I like playing with that tool. It's really exciting.
Fantastic. Thank you to Si and to Rob for chatting away about Hershey disease. Hope you're enjoying the series Earthlit. If not, I'm sure you'll let us know. Something else that's coming up soon is Case Files number 35. And my colleague Owen and I had a little chat over Zoom because even though he's only a few streets over, we're taking social distancing very seriously at 2000 AD. So, yeah, we delve down into some of the context of the book, how it holds together as a collection. Like I said, it's the first time Owen's read this stuff. It's the second time for me. If there's anything we get wrong, it's all personal opinions, but if there's anything we get wrong, then I'm sure you'll let us know. But this was a chance to deep dive into a forthcoming collection, and I hope you enjoy the chat.
We're going to just chew the cud, I guess, over Case Files 35 because it's not really often that we've had a chance to do a deep dive on a collection, if at all. And this one, well, I mean, we'll come to it. There's a rather apposite story in this collection which deserves some going over. But yeah, I really, just to get your point of view on somebody who's not necessarily deep into Dredd lore, hasn't read absolutely tons of it. Much more, your focus is much more on American comics, really. But just to get your view on how this collection works, really. I mean, what were your initial impressions when you first went through it?
I really dug it. I like that there's a really nice mix. And like you say, I'm not super... I know the broad strokes of a lot of the Dredd lore, but you are the sensei in this field. And I kind of bow to your wisdom. I really, really like... We've talked about this before. I really like the low-stakes Dredd adventure stuff more than the big epic kind of storylines, with exceptions.
Yeah.
so I like the kind of one and dones, or the, you know, we talked about a Graveyard Shift, which is basically one of my favorites. Just doing a deep dive so listeners know where I kind of settle. We'll talk about this in a little bit when we talk about A Walk in the Park, one of the first stories in there. But big fan of the Hot Dog Run. I know you're a big fan of that early stuff as well. So yeah, like the one and done stuff, or the big kind of some of the epic stuff, but I'm absolutely nowhere near a master. So coming in straight from the get-go, I like the mix of stuff was in here. They kind of you're warmed up with the kind of one and done to get you in the mode, and then you hit Sin City, which we'll talk about in due course, which is, it's a healthy page count on that. It really goes and goes. But yeah, I was a big fan. Yeah, considering it's 35 volumes in, and being, you know, a casual reader of all the Dredd lore, like, picked up a lot. It was good.
Well, I mean, ultimately, this is the strength of the case files, isn't it? That yes, you know, you can read it in order over time, but you can still dip in and out. There's no reason you can't pick up volume 35 and go, actually, this is a fairly decent slice of kind of modern Dredd. But from a historical perspective, I mean, this is what, 2002. So it's right still back at the beginning of the rebellion era. With, you know, the handover from Andy Diggle to Matt Smith has taken place, and the thing that really struck me about this collection is how the strip is still in an interstitial period, because you've got a big old clump of Alan Grant short stories in here when he was still regularly writing Dredd. You've got within that, you've got some attempts to create ongoing characters, which as both John and Alan have said for many years, is always the difficult thing to do with Dredd, is to create character, you know, villains that he doesn't immediately shoot. Right. So it's there's a and we'll come to it in a minute. There's an interesting kind of parallel with Judge Death there, and so for me, this collection felt like it was treading a lot of the tonally was treading a lot of the same notes from the past, because, you know, this is that kind of new beginning, like I said, in interstitial period. But with something like A Walk in the Park, I mean, I guess based on what you've just said, you're a fan of the procedurals, the everyday slice of life stuff.
Yeah. I mean, and some of them in here work a little bit better than others. I like Walk in the Park because I like the Dredd, which is now, I gather, has become like a regular staple, is the Dredd training cadets. Like that story, or anytime that kind of crops up, I'm kind of into it, just to see what's going to go down. And this one was really fun. I enjoyed it a lot. Like the essential premise being that the central park of Dredd World has essentially been like handed over to the creeps and the weirdos to do what they would want to do with, and it's essentially keeping them in a kind of Jurassic Park-esque sort of you know, place where they can, you know, they're contained for the night, and then Dredd kind of takes the cadets through a night to see what they can see. It's worth it for one panel of the searchlights going on, and a chap stark bollock naked apart from his boots and an axe, looking like he's going to cause some trouble. It was worth it for that, for me, just that one moment. But yeah, it's a fun story.
I mean, the notion of wilderness in Dredd is a really interesting one, because right from the very early days, you have the contrast of the city and the cursed earth, and that concept is developed and changed over time. But then within this kind of steel and rockcrete metropolis, this you know, man-made jungle, you have an interesting attitude towards nature. So when nature crops up, it tends to be places of refuge. So there was the whole story in the 80s which focused around a large garden one of the largest private gardens, and that was kind of notions of refuge and safety and happiness and peace, and Grant seems to be conflating the two here. You know, normally the areas of danger in Megacity 1 were rad pits and irradiated sectors from the Apocalypse War and the Atomic Wars and all this, that, and the other. But here it's, as you say, it's like Central Park.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this before, the idea of like sometimes it's nice where it's not, when you see Megacity 1, it's not so radically different. Like when you see inside people's houses, you know, they've got radiators or they've got like jumpers on, or there's some areas where you can mix and match based on what your story needs. And like you said, there being sort of greenery is kind of a strange thing to kind of get a piece of. And you reminded me as well when you were talking there about, it must be really, really hard for those writers when you're dealing with a long running single location, for want of a better term, to create the different levels that you need, both of like a part, the respite you're talking about, but also how do you raise the stakes when you've got the cursed earth and you cannot go out there, it's irradiate the wasteland, and you have what is essentially your status quo place that's technically safe is Megacity 1. How do you create levels of those stakes? And it's interesting to see how writers have developed different versions of how do you create the outlaw zone in the outlaw zone. So, you know, you've got the underneath of Megacity 1, which functions as a kind of underworld as well. It's always interesting to see how different people develop their own different versions of those places you can go that just give you something that's not just another night in Megacity 1. Does that make any sense? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And you're entirely right. The Undercity is like the Gothic nightmare, you know, the dark place under the psyche of Megacity 1. But so it's interesting for me with this story how it kind of keeps Rennie keeps his focus on the elements they find. So the weird is things like that. There's not really necessarily development of the space and the essence of that you get with like the Undercity. But I kind of keep coming back to that notion that you have of Central Park. So the very, I suppose, back in the pre-zero tolerance days of New York City, you know, Central Park was a no-go zone. You know, there was a lot of fear based around what was meant to be a beautiful kind of open
space. It's drawn like that in the comic. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's great. I mean, that as I got to the end, like you said, that there's not really a lot of conclusion there. There's not really it's nice that that Rennie doesn't feel the need to basically like hit a point with it. He kind of just goes, this is the place, this exists. He's kind of throwing up a bunch of things. And even at the very end, with the which is it, the Park Beast, he kind of throws a couple of things in there and be like, oh yeah, we can deal with these probably later down the road. And then you're kind of out. You've done the arc, which is just spend the night with the cadets, seeing some weird stuff. And that's kind of enough. And there's something quite nice about that. Not having to cram a load of other stuff in there. It's just, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the hot dog run from, I mean, that's in Case Files 5, which is, you know, I've been fairly vocal with my belief that that's one of the greatest Dredd stories ever written. And it's interesting the difference in threat levels. That with the hot dog run, there are cadets who die. There are, you know, there is that real sense of that they are out on their own. Whereas with this, it's much more contained. You know, they are just sweeping the park. It's almost feels like this is training wheels before the hot dog run kind of thing.
Absolutely.
I want to move on to the story that follows, which is the Crystal Skull. Well, the character is the Crystal Skull. The story is First Blood, which is Alan Grant and John Burns. And this is a character that appears, but then disappears.
So is this the first, forgive my ignorance, is this the first appearance?
Yes, yeah. You basically have one story that's setting up like a traditional megacity baddie, always threatening. You know, he says, you know, I want you to feel fear. I'll always be here. But then it's never followed up. And the opening parts of this case files do feel like lots of not necessarily failed attempts, but attempts to get something moving.
And there's balls being
itself.
thrown up in the air to kind of be like, there you go, there's a bit of that, and we'll get to all this down the road, and that's cool. The artwork's astonishing. You know, John Burns is great, but I really like the artwork on this. I think it's great.
Yeah, John Burns is one of those artists who, to be quite frank, even when he's having a bad day, he's still brilliant.
Yeah. The boot and the glove wrinkles. Anyone who can nail those wrinkles has my sword. And the wrinkles on this are really, really good.
It's interesting that even at this point, I mean, Burns had been, you know, since 2002. Burns is still working. You know, he's been working on the Order for us for a number of years, and things like Angel Zero. He did a whole bunch of Dredd over many years. So it's for me, you never really see a dip in quality. You know, I know that when I've been chatting to Garth Ennis, there's the story. I mean, he doesn't rate the story himself, but Raider in the mid '90s is a story that Carl Urban cites as one of his favourite Dredd stories. It's beautiful. It's absolutely, you know, that's the power of Burns's artwork. Is that even if it's not necessarily the strongest story or it's just a one-parter, it's still brilliant. I very vividly remember a '90s story which was about it's basically the Antiques Roadshow, and but the host was using it as a way of then knocking off the people who came on the show, and that was by Burns, and you know the artwork's just brilliant. It's
elegant stuff. It really is. There's a class to it that, like, you inject a bit of that in your collection, it kind of raises. It's just a very different vibe, especially to be sandwiched between Walk in the Park and what's next, Unnatural Selection, which is the PJ Holden artwork. There's really different kind of moods there, and it just gives you a really nice anthology quality to everything with John Burns in the middle.
Yeah, I seem to recall he doesn't like doing sci-fi.
Okay.
So
I
mean, this is the thing. Is, you know, he throughout his career was doing stuff like Modesty Blaze, which is beautiful. You know, that sense of style, that sense of dynamism and flow and everything is
but
fantastic.
He's a pulp guy. Like, you can feel that in this. There's a lot of which is the Vincent Price thing, Dr. Phibes or Phoebes or whatever. But yeah, there's that, like, you know, with the walking stick, with the clickable. There's a lot of pulp. You can see all of that kind of in his stuff.
Absolutely.
Having said he's not a sci-fi guy, like, there's I think it's on page 4 or something like that. The hospital is really, really nice.
Yeah. That's the irony. You know, somebody who doesn't necessarily enjoy sci-fi, but does. His Mega City 1 is incredible. When he was working on the period, I know I keep coming back to the 90s, but that was when I started reading at the end of the day.
Your age, but that's fine.
You know, you had Twilight's Last Gleaming, the whole referendum thing in the aftermath of Necropolis, and there's this wonderful page which is just Dredd sat on his Lawmaster with the city in the background, saying, you know, a city of 400 million people, but by God I love it, or whatever he says, and it's just an incredible vista. You know, you get a sense of like this Twilight Megacity 1 lit up with lots of neon signs and all that. It's absolutely incredible. He's one of those creators. I think we get so used to the quality level of what he does that we take it for granted. I mean, I'm not talking officially 2000 AD policy, but us as readers, we kind of go, oh yeah, it's really lovely. It's John Burns artwork, and then we just kind of go, yeah, move on.
And but deceptively, those guys make it look really deceptively easy.
Oh, 100%.
When it's that you know, they're not struggling. Well, they don't appear to be struggling for anything. So you go, wow, this is cool, but you know, we should celebrate. That's why we're here.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Now we'll move on a bit further, because the first Wagner we really come to is Leaving Rowdy.
Okay, yeah.
Uh,
Let me just say that I love wall crawlers though, really quickly, as like a one and done. It's really silly, but I really like it. But let's move on.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah, I love that one.
It's interesting that the concept of Dredd having his own apartment is something that has persisted for so long in the strip, because you go back to the early days, and it's almost kind of like a cozy British sitcom. You've got Dredd, you've got Walter the Wobot, his robotic manservant, whether he likes it or not, and you've got Maria, his Italian housekeeper. No spoilers for her later character arc, but Rowdy Yates' block. It is surprisingly persistent, and I sometimes wonder if it's always now, if it's always been an opportunity for Wagner just to have kind of like a touchstone that that's where Dredd goes to ruminate, that's where he goes to think, because you've got the amazing story where he's in a bath, his apartment, and
the whole time. For the whole time, the whole strip.
Yeah, for pretty much the entire episode, he's in the bath.
That's the noir stuff, though, isn't it? That's the really, like, you know, he's in the bath. It's a dirty old town kind of vibe.
Well, we had Al Ewing on in the last episode, where he was talking about one of the influences on him was the Parker novels, and you know, it is that kind of pulp attitude. But what's interesting with Leaving Rowdy is that this is Wagner quietly, in that wonderful kind of soft touch way that he often does, is talking about handing the baton on. So it fits into the Bloodline storyline around Rico, who is, for those who don't know, Dredd's been cloned since he had his own clone brother, so that there were a whole bunch of Dredd clones walking around. And this does feel like that kind of generational moving on notion, which he. I want to find out what you think before I sort of talk a little bit about.
Right.
Later.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I liked it a lot. I like the whole. I do like the more of the stuff you read, the more you get like, oh, this is the. Even though you know you have the standard Dredd adventures, like you say, to keep coming back to certain scenarios, certain places, certain people that are like long running, is something that I think you can only get if you're sort of a long-term reader, or you start seeing the, you know, those elements that keep cropping up. I liked it a lot. I thought there was a lot, for such a short strip, there's a lot of tension in it, especially when they go down into they're going into the garage down underneath, the tap's not dripping, spoilers, sorry. And he kind of works that out and then kind of dispatches the guys. There's a lot to like in it, and he packs a lot of action and some conversation in here. I really like it. It's interesting to see. I've been reading more and more of Carlos's coloured artwork in sort of late years, from like Origins onward and things like that. And what I didn't like about it at first has really, really grown on me. And the more of it you read, the more you like. But yeah, I think it's a great strip.
I mean, it's interesting that within 4 years of this, Wagner had embarked on, with Carlos, the Origins epic, which really did kind of go back and talk about Dredd's early days as a cadet and the overthrow of the United States by Justice Department. So it's one of the things that makes Wagner such a great writer and such an intriguing writer as well is the long game that he plays. It, you know, even when he was writing the strip with Alan every single week for a number of years in the 80s, you can see them thinking about what's coming up in 2, 3, 4 years time. So you've got stuff in here about the judge-child quest that goes all the way, not that necessarily it was thinking this far ahead, but talking about Morph, Judge Morph, who was his mentor, talking about Magruder, Lopez, Judge-child quest, and all the way back to Rico, and that's one of the backbones. I mean, I don't personally ascribe to this notion of only Wagner is canon, but
he lived it.
Yeah, but it gives the whole strip a backbone.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that everything else is excluded. It's just that it gives a remarkable sense that
Sure.
there is a continuity, there is a persistence, there is a through line there, and this is a nice kind of short story that just neatly plays with those concepts.
And I've never come across anyone that writes one character like Wagner writes Dredd with the same for the amount of dialogue that he deploys, the amount of world weariness and the weight that he gets across with that stuff is really astonishing, really.
Yeah.
That you can imbue it with that much kind of world weary, bone weary sense. It's really great.
Yeah, and there's also a sense of kind of clearing the decks a little bit, and I do wonder how far in advance Wagner was thinking about Origins and things like that. I'd have to go back through interviews and stuff, but I'm not going to dwell on the story that follows the Rowdy Yates story, but the Love Story 3, The End of the Affair, that caps off a 3-story character that goes all the way back to the 1980s. So it does create this impression that things are changing. The next generation is coming along. When I've done some of the essays for the Mega Collection, I've kind of theorized that some of Wagner's output at this time suggests that he is thinking about the next generation. Who's going to be writing this character after me? And this is the beginning of the period when you start getting a new generations of writers coming through. As you go into the 2000s, you've already got Robbie Morrison, who's got a story in this collection. You've got Al Ewing, Cy Spurrier, Rob Williams is coming up within a few years. So it does create this feel of the baton being passed in a way that John has done. But
where does it rate for you?
Second,
where does this kind of rate for you? Not in terms of like quality, because it's all good, but like you're saying that it's more of a baton, or it's an interstitial period.
Yeah. So from my point of view, you have the Pit, which is the big epic in the 90s, which kind of is John returning to Dredd for me properly. I know it wasn't that it was no Wagner and then the Pit, but this collection with Sin City, which is the story that we're going to come and talk about in a little bit, for me is a moment when Wagner is still the giant. He's still impressing his view of Dredd and the way he writes, because he needs to. It's early in the Rebellion days. The comic needed that solidity and continuity. So it's interesting to see in collection just how that becomes apparent.
Right.
And it for me, this was a period when I was a regular subscriber still. But it wasn't until Sin City, I think, that I appreciated how where the comic was at at that moment.
Right.
For me.
And amazingly, you get that sense just reading this fresh.
Yeah.
Not that the other stuff's not good; it's great, but you get the the main event. Okay, here we are, and it gives you, more on that soon.
Yeah, and it you can still see Wagner playing about with the concept and pulling the same, not the same, but putting tricks that he's pulled before out of his sleeve. You've got Block Court, which is drawn by Cam Kennedy, which is really nice, and that's an idea that's been done.
That was fun as hell. I like that one a lot.
And that's the kind of slice of life stuff. It's the silly citizen stuff with the grumpy old judge who just hasn't got time for this shit, and that for me just makes it really lovely, and that moves into Escape from Atlantis, which again touches on a location that was debuted in the 1980s.
I loved all that original Atlantis stuff, so the fact that was still kind of coming back and doing stuff with it was super cool.
No, it's lovely. And then so I'm just flicking through. You've got Mylan Grant in here, and we said we didn't want to spend too long on the initial stories before we moved on to Sin City. You have the main event, and it's always nice how I think the Pit is really the only epic that we've had to split into two.
Right.
I might be wrong. I'm sure people will correct me. Just because it went on for a very long time, but smack in the middle of this collection, you've got Sin City with one of my all-time favorite artists, who is Kev Walker.
Yeah, I want to talk about this a lot because I wasn't super familiar with Kev Walker's stuff. I've read some bits and pieces, but this blew me the F away. Sorry, I've got to watch my language. This was great. He's great.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Kev, if you're listening, nailed it, mate. Nailed it.
Yeah, the thing is, I loved his work when he was doing ABC Warriors Chronicles of Chaos in the 90s. I got to stop talking about the 90s. God's sake, Mike.
It's okay, man. It's okay.
Hey, we were all young once.
Yeah.
But it had one
just before others were young.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks a lot. Son of a bitch.
Sorry. Yeah, back to Kev. Come on.
Yeah, but we had him on the podcast a few years ago, and what I loved about Chronicles of Chaos, because he was the inker on Steve Dillon on Harlem, the reboot of Harlem Heroes in like the late 80s, early 90s, which wasn't great. But there's that wonderful anecdote he told where he happened to be in the nerve center when pages of Bisley's Horn God were coming in, and everybody sort of gathered round. And apparently, I think it was Richard Burton said, "Oh, if only we had more Simon Bisleys." And Kev just went, "I can paint." He never picked up a paintbrush in his life, so he had to go home and teach himself how to paint. And
I like that.
Chronicles of Chaos is beautiful. It's the first lot was in the ABC Warriors Mech Files books, and it's just it's so stunning. So long as he's not drawing human beings. And then
there's plenty in here though.
Yeah, well, this is later. So then you got Childhood's End, which was the Judge Anderson series where she went to Mars, and you can see him trying to adapt the style that you had on ABC Warriors to that. But by the time you get to Sin City, he's almost a completely different artist in that.
Yeah, you were saying painting, but there's a lot. At first, I saw a lot of Mignola because
absolutely,
I think, of that era. If I'm getting that era right, it's kind of that's out of the gate is what a lot of people, and some like Duncan Fegredo. But this is all selling Kev way down the river. Because as the strip goes on, you see how effective he's being at when to pull it right back in and when to add all that. I mean, even if you're just looking on page 2, I'm not going to go through this page by page. There's a great crowd scene on page 2, just on the left-hand side. That he is not scrimping on the details there or all of the individual figures.
Yeah.
But then when he has to do the old Dredd chin, and that's all you're getting in a panel, he's going to do that. But there's a really great cinematic quality to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it feels grim from that first page with the hover tugs.
Yeah.
It's real nice. It's real nice, and it just grabs you straight away.
There's well, first off, when he was on the podcast, you know, he wasn't kind of shy about saying, you know, Mignola's style, what, you know, is an influence to look at that and go, well, actually, you can make more minimal lines and get the same thing. So he's a master of sort of using black areas on the page to great effect. But the thing that really strikes me, and you know, we'll come into more detail as we go through it, is just the color that he employs. And he did this on Sin City. He did it on Mandroid. The story that started the Origins epic. There's just something about it which it almost, it feels like it comes back to what we were saying about John Burns. Actually, there's that sense of everything being in almost perpetual dusk, like a you know, a neon pea super kind of thing.
I mean, Sin City is garish as hell. If you deploy a kind of the sky is blue, you know, grass is green coloring approach, and that's minimizing coloring to, you know, whatever. But if you deploy that kind of thing, this doesn't work. You know, because it's just overkill. To kind of go for a really muted palette really grounds it, I think. Makes it really work, especially in the Satan Mr. Sin sing-along.
There's always a sing-along.
I love it. Like, I was rereading Last American the other day, and like there's a sing-along in that. I'm like, I love it when a sing-along. I can't
remember when I interviewed Wagner. I can't remember whether I asked about the singing or whether that was before we started recording. But yeah, there's always got to be a sing-along. It's fantastic.
It's perfect, and it's that whole Pinocchio thing as well, isn't it? Of like, you know, there's the barking ringmaster, like, come to my island, enjoy yourself, and be transformed. That kind of, you know, there's some mythical stuff going on here.
I mean, it's interesting. Sin City is interesting as a concept because it's been deployed before, particularly with the kind of stuff in the Cursed Earth. So when you got into the Judge Dredd quest, you know, you had these lawless places in the Cursed Earth where you could do anything, you know, and you could jump off a tall building, you could get into a fight with somebody and for prize money and things like that. So it's not a fresh concept. Where it feels fresh is Dredd's tolerance of it. Yeah. And he's doing it for a reason, because Ula Danza is there, and they're trying to stop them and all this and other. But the fact that Dredd has to restrain himself, and that's always an interesting thing. And I think as Wagner has gone on with Dredd, that seems to give him pleasure as well, because, you know, basically putting this man who wants to be able to do what he wants to do without interruption and forcing him to be outside of his comfort zone. So with the pit, you know, he was being a sector chief, and with this, it's like, well, you've got to go into this place that is a complete anathema. It is the opposite of what you want the world to be, and you have to go into it and do virtually nothing about it.
But it also it kind of proves the exception of one of Dredd as a character's main critics has been like, he's one note. Well, he's like, no, he's not. He's just it's like the man with no name. There's a very limited not a limited worldview. There is a rigid moral worldview that is not breaking the character. But within that, the situations that can test that, or, you know, are where the interest lies. And I agree that what makes this really interesting is the fact that it's bolted on a plot, you know, an undercover plot is bolted onto it, and that's what gives it the kind of drive and attention that it needs, right? While still being able to do plenty of that, like, look at some funny, silly, you know, human rights shit that's going on in this terrible place. All of the I love it whenever you get a game show, like a really twisted game show pops up, of which there's tons of them in Dredd comics, but I like the one where they take out the guy's organs as he's sat there on the thing, and there's a sort of Thunderdome-esque, you know, that scene's great where he messes up the guy at the Killer Bowl. So good. So good.
It's interesting just how multi-layered this story is, because you do have that kind of over-the-topness, people being able to get away with whatever they wanted to do, but it's still a procedural. You know,
yeah, it's a complete meal. It really is.
Yeah, and you know, you get to the page where there's the undercover division briefing, and in each of these panels, the first one, there's 2 4 panels, then 2 4 5 panels, each with 20, 25 words in each bubble, and that is an incredible amount of information, and somehow it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel exposition heavy, because that's the kind of thing you expect from a briefing.
Yeah.
And
they keep it, and it's like a page.
Yeah.
It's like 1 page or 2 pages. It's like, that's your briefing, off you go. And then you, at least with that initial briefing, you're following up with El Muerte. So you're kind of going, okay, well, here's some potentially dry shit, but then, okay, here you go, you're in the Killer Bowl, and he's got a laser whip.
Yeah.
You know, you're like, if you're bored by that, you're not going to be for long. You know,
it's
clever stuff.
It's interesting that, and I'm going to put a spoiler alert at the beginning of this whole thing anyway, but you know, spoilers. It's interesting that when it's revealed that Orlok the assassin is going to be a part of this.
Yeah.
And he is doing what he did way back in Blockmania, and that's delivering a disease, you know, a neurotoxin or whatever, to destabilize and kill loads of people. That's the least interesting thing about this story.
Yeah.
You know,
that's like an Act 3, like, oh, here you go, just some extra.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's your take on the whole?
I'm still looking at the guy who swallows that woman who sat with a swimming cap on. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
What's your take on the whole Guthrie thing? Because Guthrie's an interesting character who sort of came out of the pit and has had various writers touch on him over the period. So he's changed an awful lot. And in this, it's interesting what Wagner does with him. I'm not entirely sure it fits with the kind of arc of his character or not.
Yeah, well, I don't know very much about the character at all. I got the sense very much that in the same, this could be, you know, shooting myself in the foot here, but I feel like a lot of great Dredd and Anderson stories give sort of, you know, counterbalance to each other, if that makes any sense. So you always, which is what I think was really good about the Dredd film, is you always need someone that's playing against Dredd. And from what I took from this story, is Guthrie gives, I got very much from where he's at here, is that he's a far more, you know, emotionally wrung out version of Dredd, or someone who clearly seems pulled over the ringer about all of his family ties and things like that. So it without it, you've kind of got all of the crazy stuff that's happening in Sin City, the procedural stuff and the undercover stuff, which is very, you know, grim. You don't have really a lot of emotional beats, which is kind of what the Guthrie stuff is supplying. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but that's what I kind of got out of it.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't know the full wider arc of his character and stuff, so...
It's interesting when talking about Orlok, for example, that by the time we get to like the latter stage of the whole thing, which is where Orlok releases this this disease with the hope of killing everybody, destroying Mega City 1, getting his revenge. It reads much more less like a climax and more like a denouement.
Yeah.
You know, this is the how Wagner winds down, and there's an interesting parallel in the way John does this with the end of Chaos Day. So as Chaos Day gets to its worst point, you don't necessarily have an awful lot of drama. That's the wrong way of phrasing that. No,
I see what you mean.
But it's like it reaches a plateau, and that plateau is really grim. But you know, he allows it to coast so that the enormity of what he's done, what he's written, sinks in. Whereas with Sin City, you still have that face-off between Muerte and Dredd at the end, while all these terrible things are going on. So yeah, it's interesting, the parallels between those two, how he deals with those two things.
But you know, I think I'm agreeing with you. But you always need some fisticuffs, I think. And also, I found it astonishing that this still reads really, really cleanly. There's some stuff that I'll read and it feels stilted when it's supposed to be read weekly. But then when collected, there's a couple of like, you know, it's like a layer change on a DVD. There's just a little bit of a like, well, I never got any of that with Sin City. I think it plays pretty much as well and as smoothly as you could expect it to. But you're absolutely right that for me, the captivating bit in it is how Dredd reacts in that situation. It's the undercover stuff. And I think Wagner probably realizes once you've kind of, the truth has come out, that tension kind of drops off a bit. So it's time for some stuff to blow up just to keep things moving. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, by that point, it's amazing that by the time kind of Orlok arrives, you kind of go, well, you know, this is only going to go one way now. But that's to the story's credit, you know.
Oh, absolutely. But it's interesting how it fits in with the later stuff with the trial of Orlok, and kind of later epics. In that this is just one act. You know, this lots of people, including myself, focus on the mega epics, so your Apocalypse War, your Necropolis, things like that. But actually, I think the mega epic that Wagner does has evolved as a concept as it's come into the 21st century. Where
from what to what?
Well, from being like an event.
Yeah.
That had a beginning and an end, and there were stories afterwards that dealt with it. So after the Apocalypse War, you had the Fatties, you had the John Cooper story with the Sov judge hiding in the Air Bowl stadium, and you know, you had ramifications, but the epic was still an event. Whereas as you get into the 21st century, things like the ongoing storyline with Orlok, Tour of Duty, the stuff around Origins, you know, it's actually epics that have a lot of stages. Yeah, so you know, this big blowout, Sin City, is just a chapter in an ongoing storyline, and that almost makes, for me, that makes them almost more epic than epic, you know. And they were.
Well, you're a big fan of history, and you've often said that like there's no beginning or end point. There are always just like, when do you choose to jump on and off? Yeah. And that feels more real in that way. If you've got sort of Dredd is having, you know, 17 epics in which 17 choices are made, and the ramifications of all of those becomes far more, you know, it's a more organic soap opera.
Yeah,
Really.
absolutely. And so it's you know, for me, it's fascinating to see writers like Michael Carroll and Rob Williams develop their own ongoing epic storylines. You know, for Michael, it's a whole Irish question, and you know, the ninja judges, and also with Rob, it's the post trifecta fallout with Judge Smiley, which continues into the new Judge Hershey storyline. Just on Sin City, I mean, coming back to what I was saying before, like it anchors this collection. You know, it's
how many pages is it? I don't have it up here, but
it's a good question.
Very hefty.
So it starts there. Where's that? 93. So I'm just going off my iPad.
Yeah, mine just died. So.
Blimey. So it starts at 93. You're going to have to help me with the maths.
Oh God, what are you talking about? You've met me, right?
Finishes at 170. So 170 minus 93. That's 77.
Hey, that's a nice little collection, that.
Yeah, I think that's right. But yeah, it's the main course. That's what it feels like in this collection.
Yeah.
But after a comedic interlude about the royal family, which is always fun when 2080 is stuff about the royals, you have Blood and Duty, which nicely bookends because you have the Rowdy Yates story before it, but then you have this story involving Vienna Dredd, who is Dredd's niece. And it's a multi-part story, and it really chomps down.
Are you a fan
of the Vienna Dredd stuff?
Yeah.
I don't think I was to begin with, just because I don't think I was overly familiar.
Yeah.
With the very early days, because that's something that I caught up on much later. But the way that John has handled it and the stories that he has done about Vienna, I think she is a really handy mirror to hold up against Dredd. Because, as we were talking about before, it forces him, like it puts him under pressure. It removes this binary notion that he has of the world, that there is, you know, the guilty and the not guilty. Though everyone's guilty, surely. But anyway, and I suppose you could think of Dredd as like a reactive chemical that, when left alone, remains the same. But the second you start putting it under any kind of pressure that it's not used to, it can become volatile. You know, it can behave in unpredictable ways. So at the end of this story, he says, you know, Call of Duty. He refers back to the only thing he's ever really known, which is his sense of duty. Now, for most people, that will have a positive connotation, but of course, with Dredd, as with most of the things that he phrases that he uses, it's a double-edged sword, because for him, duty is his purpose. It's what he was created to do. But for the citizens, duty can be a horrible thing, because his duty is to uphold this repressive system.
Yeah.
Now, Vienna calls that into question. You know, her desire for a life, desire for purpose, a desire for happiness. Those things are a complete anathema to Dredd. He doesn't understand.
It seems certainly it's a very different, not a very different reading of the character. But if you read this whole collection with totally fresh, you get to that and you kind of go, wow, this is pretty. It's very different, and it's amazing that in that story he's the most unsure he is in any of the stuff in that collection.
Yeah, and it's I mean, it's masterful from Wagner, because either side of this big story is Sin City. At the beginning, you've got the Rowdy Yates story, where he's talking to Rico, who is literally a copy of him. You know, he is intended to be there to replace Dredd, so that the city has more Dredds. and by and large, they're the same person. They believe in the same things. They're both judges. But then after that terrible apocalyptic event, you then have the confrontation with Vienna. And again, this feels like Wagner playing the long game, because Vienna is laying the groundwork, seeding the doubt. Not that she understands it, but that when you have Origins in a few years and you have the Fargo clan, and Dredd suddenly is faced with the consequences of the system that he upholds. The system is not repressing Vienna any more than it oppresses anybody else. So Dredd can, brush that off and justify it and everything. But with the Fargo clan, they are literally the victims of an injustice. And I talked about this on the last episode of the podcast. He is a micro operator in a macro world. So he very much, he's a man of the streets. He's the graveyard shift. He is. There is a problem.
With this problem. There's a hammer. I'm.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
A hammer for the nails.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the second he has to start thinking strategically, or more widely, politically as well, he doesn't work as a psyche, because it requires him to think about grey areas and to make judgment calls that the law cannot necessarily deal with. Or when he looks at the mutant laws, he said, well, this is unjust. So Dredd as an agent of justice and an agent of the law is a really interesting dichotomy that's built up over the last 40 odd years, and one that he continues to struggle with, even though he comes out of Origins or literally all guns blazing. Like there's like a palate cleanser immediately after Origins where he said, yeah, back on the streets, watch out perps. Even with that, as we go into the Tour of Duty stuff and Mutants in Mega City 1 and all this, that and the other, he's dealing with the fallout. He can't just shoot a gun and solve that problem.
I think it's really hard to pick up those grace notes if you're a casual reader.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And although everyone who's listening to this who hasn't got a copy already should definitely go out and buy this, plug. It's only when you read some of these storylines all together that you're going to get a lot of that. The stuff isn't great, but it's like any character. There's been a huge evolution in their character as things have gone on.
But it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning was that you can pick them up and enjoy them.
Yeah.
But there is
you're going to get a lot more.
Yeah, there's more reading you can do to really delve into it. I mean, what I find fascinating about the case files is after we hit 1991, we obviously started including the magazine stories as well, which is really interesting to contrast the storytelling between the weekly installments, which are 5 or 6 pages, and then you get these big wadges of a single story, which are 8, 9, 10 pages an episode. I mean, how did you feel about that change of pace?
Which are the first ones in the collection to start being longer?
Flippers is the first one from the magazine, I think.
Oh, okay. I didn't notice, to be honest.
Right.
I was just enjoying every story for what it was. I had a great time regardless. So it was only in the when I actually sat down to notice was during Sin City when I was realizing that I was just flickering straight through this without stopping. And I understand those are prog books. So yeah.
I think particularly by this stage, the Meg had been through some really rough years. There'd been still ongoing at this point. There was a lot of reprint that had to be in there to make it cost effective. But what I find interesting about the stories in this, even though there was a lot of debate amongst the fandom about whether the magazine was worth it, whether it should continue doing it, these stories still hold up. Particularly in collection, the Otto Sump story, Flippers, which is a actually a bit of a favourite of mine, because it deals with corrupt judges, but judges who are in love, and the way that the pressure of the system impinges on them, and how that.
I really like that story. It was great.
Yeah, you've got some great John Higgins artwork later on in the collection, and I think this is, and I realise I work in marketing, but this is kind of archetypal of the case files, in that you've got a big meaty read in there, which is Sin City. You've got lots of other little stories, and nothing. The quality doesn't really drop below great. You know, there's stories that might not be to my taste, but the artwork's still great. And then within 5-6 pages, you've got an absolute cracker.
The Masters thing is the change in tone, and the fact that you can do different tones within the book and it not feel weird, because, you know, and that's a credit to the commissioning, that especially when they're separated by weeks and months and stuff like that, that there is enough different kinds of tones, one story to the next, you're kind of entertained. Very good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question is, as a casual reader, as somebody who doesn't know all the law or anything like that, coming out of this, how contrast it with how you felt going into it?
I genuinely, this far down the line, I thought that I would be, because I've read standalone books, and a bunch of them, but in terms of my actual case files reading, I'm in like I'm very early on. I'm about on volume 10, stuff like that. So it's still really, really early stuff. But I know the broader things, and we've talked about them, and also, you know, working in the nerve center, you're just going to pick up a load of stuff by osmosis and things like that. So, but I thought I would be more at sea than I actually was. I think I had enough. These are the bare bones of the character to know, but will I still be entertained? And I was. It does come alive once you hit Sin City for me, because you're grounded in okay, this is your feature presentation, and here it is. But there's something in there for everyone. Wall Crawlers is a banger. I'm just saying. But yeah, it's really good. It's a great book.
Yeah.
It makes me want to go back and read some of the, like you said, some of the Spine stuff. Read Origins again. Read, you know, a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, a worthy read.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that, Owen. That was a really interesting chat. Hopefully we'll be doing more kind of deep dives into collections and
straight from the ISO cubes.
Yeah. Yeah, quite.
I like your name, the Lockdown Tapes, by the way. I think that's...
Oh, thank you.
It's nice.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks very much, and no doubt we'll see you again on the thrillcast.
Till next time.
Great stuff. Thank you so much to Owen for taking the time to do that. Like I said, it's just our personal opinion. It was nice to be able to chomp down onto a bit of a meaty collection and see what we thought. If we've got anything wrong, or you vehemently disagree with what we were saying, then do get in touch. thrillcast@2000ad.com. That's THRILLCAST @2000ad.com. We'll be back next week with another 2 episodes. We've got some really meaty interviews coming up. Also, at least another deep dive into a classic collection. So, yeah, it's something to look forward to. Hope you've really enjoyed this episode. Do let us know what you think at thrillcast@2000ad.com. And stay safe, Earthlets, in these quarantine times. Splundig Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.